Under the soft golden light of an early Charleston morning, a young woman walked alone down a quiet cobblestone street lined with tall oaks and weathered brick buildings. Her steps were steady but slow, the slight unevenness in her gait noticeable only to those who looked closely. And few did. Her name was Abigail Sloane, but those who once knew her well had called her Abby. At 28, she had the face of someone younger, soft, open, framed by sun-bleached waves braided neatly down her back. She wore a light cotton dress in a faded shade of blue, clean but plain, like something a schoolteacher might choose for summer. It caught the breeze as she moved, brushing against her knees, revealing sturdy, worn combat boots laced tightly around her ankles. A jarring contrast that few would expect on a woman like her. A canvas bag hung from her shoulder, faded green, its edges fraying with age and use. As she passed a storefront window, her reflection flickered between polished mannequins in linen blazers, a surreal mirror of worlds that rarely touched. She paused for a breath, shifting her weight, the subtle motion revealing a glimpse of a rigid black brace beneath her dress, hugging her knee tightly. Her fingers brushed over it unconsciously before falling back to her side. Abby wasn't particularly old, nor did she appear fragile in the usual sense. In fact, she was quite beautiful in an unassuming way. The kind of beauty that seemed carved not from cosmetics or youth, but from time, survival, and something deeply personal. She stopped near the entrance of an art gallery. The building had been recently renovated, its modern glass facade jutting out from between two centuries-old structures like a quiet declaration of elitism. Inside, abstract sculptures floated on marble pedestals under cool lighting, and behind the tinted glass, silhouettes of tall, slender people with stemmed glasses in hand moved through a private preview. Abby leaned slightly against the brick wall beside the gallery's door, not to intrude, but simply to rest. Her breathing was measured but tired, the kind of fatigue that sits deeper than muscles and bones. A group exited the gallery a few feet away. Two young men and a woman, all well-dressed in crisp, curated outfits meant to suggest effortlessness. One of them glanced at Abby, then said with a tight laugh, "Excuse me, but you're kind of blocking the view. You might want to move over." His tone was light but sharp. It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal, the kind that pretends to be polite. The others chuckled faintly as he stepped forward and nudged past her shoulder without waiting for a reply. The movement forced her a step off balance, and she instinctively reached for the wall to steady herself. Her canvas bag slipped slightly from her shoulder, but she caught it before it fell. Abby said nothing. She simply righted herself, adjusted her strap, and stepped aside. The group continued walking without a second glance, their voices fading into the distance. A nearby couple seated at a cafe patio table noticed the brief exchange but returned to their croissants without comment. Nothing had happened. Not in their eyes. Just a girl standing where she shouldn't have, dressed in a way that didn't match the setting. The moment passed like dust in sunlight. She glanced briefly into the gallery window. A large canvas displayed near the front read "The Fragility of Presence" in bold serif lettering, part of the featured exhibit. Below it, a sculpture of a hollow female torso cast in chrome, curved like a question mark, surrounded by petals made of broken glass. Abby's lips parted slightly, not in admiration or offense, but recognition. There was something familiar in the posture of the statue, in the tension of its form. Something unspoken that she understood on an intimate level. But instead of going in, she simply turned away. Her hand brushed her dress again, fingertips grazing the outline of a small, square object in the side pocket of her bag. A folded cloth, something tucked away with care? She didn't reach for it. Not yet. The time for that hadn't come. As she continued down the street, she passed a woman her mother's age who caught her gaze briefly. For a moment, their eyes locked. A flicker of something unspoken between generations. But the woman turned away, the way people often do when they sense a story they're not prepared to hear. And Abby just kept walking. A few blocks down from the gallery, the quiet charm of the street began to fade into something sleeker, louder, more curated. Boutique cafes spilled onto wide sidewalks with carefully arranged outdoor seating, each chair draped with neutral-toned cushions, each table topped with a single glass vase and a tightly coiled white rose. The patrons, young professionals, wealthy tourists, art students pretending not to be, seemed absorbed in a constant theatrical performance of leisure. Their laughter rose and fell in calculated waves, their movements slow, deliberate, as though everything they did was being quietly recorded for an invisible audience. Abby crossed the intersection and moved toward a bench in a shady corner of a small plaza. She didn't look like she belonged here, not in the curated sense. She looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn from a different part of town, the part not listed in glossy tourist guides or lifestyle magazines. But she didn't hesitate. She walked with the same quiet purpose she had earlier, neither proud nor meek. She simply was, and that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle those who noticed her. As she neared the bench, she slowed, her right hand briefly touching her knee. A flash of discomfort passed over her face, the kind that isn't visible unless you know what to look for. She sat slowly, carefully, adjusting the bag on her lap. From inside, she removed a small notebook. Spiral-bound, the edges soft and bent, the pages slightly yellowed at the corners. She opened it to a page halfway through and stared down at the sketch she'd been working on earlier that morning. A loose charcoal rendering of a woman's silhouette crouched beneath a shattered arch. There was something raw about the lines, something honest. She tilted her head slightly, as though considering whether to change something, then set the book aside on the bench beside her. Across the plaza, at the outdoor tables of one cafe in particular, the kind that charged $15 for a glass of orange juice, freshly squeezed by someone in an apron made of linen and irony, a woman was pointing. She was in her 30s, immaculate in appearance, every strand of hair precisely curled, every accessory placed as though styled for a photo shoot. Next to her sat a man in a sports blazer, his sunglasses pushed into his perfect hair, arms casually draped over the back of his chair. The woman leaned in toward her companion and murmured something, nodding subtly in Abby's direction. The man looked over his shoulder, his expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. A quiet disdain, not for the woman herself, but for the disruption she represented. He said something back, prompting a smile from the woman, who then reached into her purse and retrieved a small leather-bound journal. She flipped it open, seemingly taking notes on something. After a few moments, she rose from her chair and began walking directly toward the bench. Abby, who had picked up her sketchpad again, looked up only when the woman stood a few feet away. There was a beat of silence, not quite awkward, but charged with a kind of social tension that was all too familiar. "Excuse me," the woman began, her voice pleasant but controlled, as though each word had been vetted before being spoken. "I'm curating a visual essay for an urban aesthetic series, and I'm photographing the plaza for inclusion. The composition's quite delicate. Would you mind relocating? Just for a few minutes, perhaps?" She gestured vaguely toward the bench, her carefully manicured fingers fluttering as though trying to dispel Abby's presence without touching it. "It's nothing personal," she added with a soft smile, "but we're focusing on clean, minimalist lines. And, well..." Abby closed her sketchbook gently, her gaze steady. She didn't respond right away. The woman seemed to misread the silence as hesitation. "I understand if you're resting," she continued, her tone sharpening just enough to betray the performance. "It's just that your position is interrupting the visual flow. From that angle," she pointed again, this time toward the center of the plaza, "we lose the continuity between the sculpture and the south-facing wall. It breaks the frame." Abby blinked once, slowly, and then, without a word, reached down and slid her sketchbook into her bag. She stood carefully, brushing the back of her dress with one hand. Her face didn't change. No visible irritation, no sarcasm, not even sadness. Just a quiet resignation. A familiar dance done too many times before. The woman smiled again, satisfied, and returned to her table. Abby stepped away from the bench, limping slightly, and moved toward the shade of a tree on the far end of the square. As she walked, a group of young people passed her. Students probably from the art college nearby. One of them, a guy with a camera around his neck and paint on his fingers, gave her a once-over and whispered something to his friend. The girl glanced back at Abby and smirked, raising an eyebrow. They passed by without a word. A breeze picked up, rustling the leaves above the plaza and sending a few early petals spiraling to the ground. Abby reached the tree and leaned lightly against its trunk. From her bag, she pulled out a small thermos and unscrewed the cap. The water inside was lukewarm. She sipped it slowly. Back at the cafe, the woman and her companion were now snapping photos with an expensive mirrorless camera, testing angles and exposure. The bench, now empty, featured prominently in the frame. The sunlight was just right. The lines were clean. The space was at last undisturbed. Only a few people had noticed the exchange. One of them was a man seated alone near the corner of the plaza, older, gray-haired, in a simple button-down shirt and reading glasses. He watched the interaction without expression, his newspaper folded in his lap. He made no move to intervene, no sign of protest. But he didn't look away either. And across from him, a little girl in a yellow sundress clutched her mother's hand and pointed toward Abby, asking something in a voice too low to hear. The mother responded with a pat on the head and guided her daughter in the opposite direction. Not unkindly, but with the instinct of someone used to steering around discomfort. Abby remained beneath the tree for several minutes. She wasn't watching anyone. Her eyes were fixed on something just past the horizon of the plaza. A flickering in the distance, not of light, but of memory. She held the thermos in both hands, not drinking, just grounding herself. She didn't need to ask why she had been asked to move. She had heard variations of the request her entire life. You don't fit here. You don't match. You're not what we expected to see. And even now, years after returning home, even in a country that she had once bled for, even in the city that had once hailed her name before forgetting it entirely, she still encountered the same polite dismissals, the same thin smiles, the same unspoken message, please, just be invisible, for our sake. But Abby had never been invisible. Not really, not when it mattered. Abby wandered from the plaza into a quieter side street, where the noise of curated life dimmed behind stone walls and antique iron gates. She didn't walk with the aimlessness of someone lost, but with the calm, steady rhythm of someone used to navigating unseen, as though every step were measured in memory. Her gait had a weight to it now. Not just physical, but emotional. Something coiled deep inside her, unspoken but pressing against her ribs with every breath. The side street opened into a narrow alley shaded by overgrown jasmine vines and trailing ivy, and nestled near the end of it, almost hidden, stood a cafe she hadn't seen in years. The sign had changed, the soft script letters now blocky and modern, but the structure was the same. Pale blue trim, wide windows, and a patio that looked out over a sunken garden. She hesitated for a moment before stepping through the threshold. The space inside was cooler, dimly lit, but inviting in that vaguely impersonal way modern spaces often are. Warm tones, exposed brick, Edison bulbs hanging in a calculated mess from the ceiling. The tables were occupied mostly by students, early professionals, people with laptops and espresso cups who eyed newcomers not with curiosity but calculation. She approached the counter, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her bag as she read the unfamiliar chalkboard menu. When the barista looked up, a young man maybe 22, with a nose ring and a tattoo creeping from his collar, she gave him a quiet nod. "Just water, please," she said, her voice low but clear. He glanced at her attire, at the boots, at the frayed bag strap, and then back to her face with a look that flickered between indifference and judgment. Still, he filled a glass and slid it toward her without a word. She thanked him softly and moved toward a corner table near the window. Sliding into the chair, she set her bag on the floor and took a sip from the glass. Her leg ached more than usual, likely from standing too long, but she didn't shift to favor it. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out the notebook again, and reopened to the page she had started earlier. The lines had smudged in transit, leaving shadows beneath the strokes like echoes of movement. She reached into her pocket and retrieved a charcoal pencil, the end worn down, her fingers moving automatically, the rhythm as natural as breathing. She had only been drawing for a few minutes when a voice, sharp and theatrical, rose from the next table. "I'm telling you, it's deliberate," said a woman, her voice clipped with the practiced edge of someone used to being heard. "That kind of costume, boots with a dress, it's performative, like trauma chic." Abby didn't look up, but her pencil stilled. Another voice responded, a man's, amused, indulgent. Or maybe it's just vintage military. I mean, it's Charleston. People wear Confederate flag bikinis unironically, so who knows? The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was precise, calculated, the kind that slices across the room and seeks its target without needing eye contact. Abby returned to her sketch, her fingers tightening around the pencil. She knew this game, the passive-aggressive theater of small spaces, the way some people cloak cruelty in wit and aesthetic detachment, She had seen it in barracks, in classrooms, in meeting rooms full of officials who never left desks, but decided how others would live and die. The woman continued, now speaking in a stage whisper as if assuming the person she mocked couldn't possibly hear or comprehend. Honestly, if you're going to cosplay a war hero, at least commit to the bit. Maybe throw on some medals, you know? Go full method. Her companion laughed again and Abby turned a page in her sketchbook. Her hand was steady, but a tremor had settled in her jaw. At that moment, the front door opened, and a gust of warm air followed a new customer inside. A man in a clean navy uniform, older, silver at the temples, with a calm expression and a satchel over his shoulder. His arrival didn't cause much of a stir, though one or two heads turned briefly before returning to laptops. He ordered something quietly, thanked the barista, and scanned the cafe before settling at a table across from Abby's, his back to the center of the room. For a few moments, the cafe's rhythm resumed. Fingers tapping keyboards, milk steamed, conversations murmur soft. Then the woman, emboldened now, raised her voice just slightly. You think she'll notice if we ask to have her removed? I mean, come on, this isn't a shelter. Her tone dripped with affected concern. It's an art cafe. At this, the man in uniform shifted slightly in his chair, not turning, just tilting his head. He set his coffee down and glanced toward the window where Abby sat. Their eyes met for the briefest instant, and something passed between them. Recognition, not necessarily personal, but collective. A shared understanding born of the same language that has no words. The weight of things seen and carried. Abby turned back to her sketch. The lines were harder now, more angular. The arch she had drawn had cracked. Behind her, the barista cleared his throat and approached slowly. He wasn't comfortable, but he had a job to do. Hey, he said, leaning in awkwardly. Just checking. Is everything okay over here? He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the table behind her where the woman was now pointedly ignoring him, flipping through a photography book. You're not, bothering anyone, right? Abby looked up at him, blinking once. Her face remained calm, even gentle, but there was something in her eyes that made him hesitate. Not aggression, but a depth of silence he hadn't expected. She shook her head. I'm just drawing, she said. He lingered unsure, then gave a stiff nod and turned back to the counter. Abby glanced toward the woman, who now wore a small, victorious smirk. The man in uniform stood. He crossed the room slowly, his coffee untouched, and stopped at Abby's table. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask to sit. He simply said, "Ma'am, I'd like to see what you're drawing." Abby hesitated only a moment, then turned the notebook and slid it toward him. He leaned down and studied the image, the broken arch, the figure beneath it, and nodded slowly. "You were there," he said, not as a question. Abby didn't answer. She didn't need to. He looked at her again, longer this time, and something shifted in the air. Then, without raising his voice or changing his tone, he turned to face the rest of the cafe and spoke. She has every right to be here, more than most. He didn't say who he was. He didn't name her. He didn't explain. But something in the quiet authority of his voice, the certainty, the depth, caused even the woman at the next table to look up sharply, her mouth halfway open to speak. No one replied. The man turned back to Abby and gave her a short, respectful nod. Then he returned to his seat and drank his coffee in silence. Abby stared down at her drawing, the lines now sharper, deeper, but truer. The arch, though broken, still stood. Abby left the cafe just after noon, the heat rising from the pavement in thin, wavering veils. The street outside had grown brighter, harsher, as if the world itself had turned its gaze more directly toward her. She didn't rush. Her movements remained composed, deliberate, even as the low throb in her leg spread upward into her hip. She had walked through pain before. It had accompanied her like a shadow through deserts and cities, through days of combat and nights of silence. Pain, in its constancy, had almost become a companion. Not welcome, but familiar. She adjusted the strap of her bag, which now pulled uncomfortably at her shoulder, and made her way toward a part of town she hadn't visited in years. The old Civic Hall stood at the edge of a long brick avenue, its faded columns and chipped steps, holding onto a kind of municipal dignity. It had been repurposed years ago into a cultural space, mostly for local events and small exhibitions. Today, a handmade banner hung limply above the entrance, bearing the words, "Faces of Service, a Community Tribute." Abby approached the steps slowly, her hand trailing briefly along the rusted railing. She remembered this place as it used to be, a place where her high school had held assemblies, where city officials had once honored returning soldiers. The irony of returning now, uninvited, unnoticed, struck her like a breath held too long. Inside, the air was cool and stale, heavy with the scent of old wood polish and forgotten paper. A group of volunteers, mostly young and chipper in matching t-shirts, stood near a folding table covered with pamphlets and water bottles. Abby nodded at them politely, and though a few returned her greeting, none paid her real attention. She moved past them into the main hall, where rows of easels held portraits, pencil drawings, photographs, and digital prints of local veterans submitted by family members and community artists. Some were detailed, others simple, many accompanied by short handwritten stories clipped to the frames. She walked slowly through the rows, studying the faces. A man in his 40s with a prosthetic arm, grinning next to his golden retriever. A stern-looking woman in navy dress whites, a metal ribbon pinned crookedly to her chest. A faded photo of a teenage boy in a Marine uniform, taken long before the war had written its name into his bones. Abby paused at each, taking time to read the stories, to absorb the weight of every life represented. She didn't cry. She rarely did. But her throat tightened with something deeper than sadness. A recognition that reached into the hollows of her past and curled its fingers around her spine. Toward the back of the room, on a smaller display board less adorned than the others, she found a photo she had not expected. It was an old print, grainy, likely scanned from a news clipping. She recognized it instantly. She was in the background, not the focus. A half-shadowed figure helping lift a wounded man into a helicopter. Her helmet was tilted back, dust streaking her face, her expression unreadable. She hadn't even known this photo existed. Beneath it, a typed label read simply, "Unidentified Medical Specialist Fallujah 2017. No name, no context. Just a date and a vague title, like a footnote in a larger, forgotten story. She stared at it for a long time, unmoving. Something cold and steady settled in her chest. It wasn't anger exactly, it was closer to a realization. The quiet, slow sinking of a stone into still water. She wasn't unknown. She had lived that moment, had bled in that dust, had pulled that soldier to safety while mortars thundered against the broken earth. She had a name. She had given more than most ever would. And still, in the city where she had once been welcomed home with flags and parades, her face was now a mystery, tucked among strangers' stories with the label unidentified. She turned away, taking a few steps toward the folding chairs arranged in a corner. A speaker was beginning to address the small audience gathered near the front. A young man, confident, in a crisp shirt and polished shoes. He spoke about sacrifice and service, with the clarity of someone who had never heard a bullet fly past his ear, who had never sat for hours beside a body they couldn't save. Abby listened for a few moments before sitting down quietly at the edge of the group. The words washed over her. Well-meaning, polished, but empty in the places where meaning should live. Near her, a woman in her 60s wiped away a tear as the speaker described his grandfather's valor in Korea. Across the aisle, a teenage girl clutched a program bearing the photo of her brother. All around her were people trying to remember, trying to honor, trying to feel something close to understanding. Abby didn't resent them, but she couldn't join them either. Her war had never fit into speeches. It had lived in the moments no one documented. In the stillness after an explosion, in the eyes of the child whose mother would never return, in the silence of her own bunk after the letters stopped coming. When the applause began, she stood and moved toward the back door. Her hand brushed the photograph of herself one last time. She pulled a small pen from her bag. A simple thing, black ink, worn cap, and without hesitation she wrote her name in neat letters beneath the photo. Abigail Sloan, U.S. Army Medical Corps. That was all. No rank, no flourish, just the truth. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the noise of the city returned in waves. Car horns, footsteps, conversations. But something inside her had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. For the first time in a long while, she felt her presence take up space again. Not as an intruder, not as a stranger to be pushed aside, but as someone who had lived through fire and returned to tell the story. Whether anyone was ready to listen or not. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the buildings, softening the sharp lines of the city's colonial architecture, Abby found herself standing before a tall glass building with a clean, polished facade that gleamed like authority itself. The City Museum, a modern addition to Charleston's historic core, had recently opened a new wing dedicated to American identity, portraits in progress, a multimedia exhibition meant to explore the complexities of personal and collective heritage in contemporary society. The irony of its title didn't escape her, nor did the fact that its entrance was surrounded by people dressed in curated versions of casual elegance, speaking in low tones, sipping complimentary drinks through compostable straws. She hadn't intended to attend the exhibit, but something in her movements that day had not been intentional at all. Her path had led her here, like a current she hadn't resisted, as if her feet knew something her mind hadn't yet accepted. At the entrance, a young woman in a blazer with an embroidered museum logo greeted each guest with a bright, mechanical smile and a name-checking clipboard. Abby waited in line, her expression neutral, her sketchbook tucked under one arm. When it was her turn, the hostess's eyes scanned her from top to bottom with the sort of politeness that conceals judgment like sugarcoats bitterness. "Do you have a reservation or press credentials?" she asked, still smiling, though the warmth had drained slightly from her voice. Abby met her gaze and answered simply, "Neither." She offered no justification. After a moment's pause, the hostess hesitated, unsure whether to enforce or override whatever guidelines she believed applied to this interaction. Before she could respond, another staff member leaned in, an older man with a gray beard and museum badge hanging from a lanyard. He glanced at Abby, blinked as though trying to place a face from long ago, then gave the hostess a quick nod. "She's fine," he said. "Let her through." Abby stepped inside. The space was immense, high-ceilinged, full of sound that echoed too cleanly, and the kind of echo that amplifies not just noise, but the absence of comfort. Visitors moved slowly between the installations, pausing in front of projected videos, interactive mirrors, photographs arranged in grids. There was a sharp, curated sterility to it all. A sense that this was not a place for real stories, but for representations of them, repackaged into digestible art for an audience with the luxury of distance. Abby made her way past a series of screens playing slow-motion footage of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island, followed by an installation of military memorabilia behind glass. Neatly arranged, color-coded, stripped of smell, sweat, and dust. Medals floated in velvet-lined boxes like artifacts from an extinct civilization. In the far corner of the room stood a long wall of digital portraits, shifting every few minutes to cycle through hundreds of faces submitted online. Self-portraits, family photos, filtered images of soldiers, farmers, drag performers, professors, mothers, athletes. Above them, in minimalist typeface, were the words, "We the people." Abby watched as the portraits dissolved into one another until she found herself staring at the frozen face of a young man in uniform, mouth slightly parted, eyes unblinking. And then he was gone, replaced by another, then another. As she stood there, a voice behind her said, "Striking, isn't it?" Abby turned to see a tall woman in her 40s, elegantly dressed with a curator's badge clipped to her blouse. "That's my favorite piece in the whole exhibit," she continued. "It's about unity through diversity. Everyone belongs here, and every story matters." Abby didn't speak, only nodded faintly. The woman's eyes drifted to Abby's boots, then to her sketchbook. "Are you an artist?" she asked, clearly curious. "You look familiar. Were you part of the local submissions? Or a guest speaker, maybe?" "No," Abby replied. "Just passing through." The woman tilted her head slightly, considering. "Have we met before? You look familiar." "Doubt it," Abby said, her voice calm but final. The curator hesitated, then shifted into the smooth rhythm of practiced diplomacy. "Well, I hope the exhibit speaks to you. That's what it's for, after all. To make people feel seen." The words rang hollow as they settled in the air between them. Abby looked back at the wall, her eyes following the slow cycle of anonymous faces. She could feel her name sitting just beneath her tongue, waiting, but she said nothing. The curator moved on, already halfway toward her next conversation. Further into the room, a temporary panel display caught Abby's attention. It was titled Invisible Labor, Service, Silence, Survival. Beneath the title were photographs of healthcare workers, firefighters, sanitation crews, and military medics. The final frame featured a low-resolution image pulled from a news broadcast. A woman in military fatigues kneeling beside a wounded man, her face obscured by smoke. Abby froze. She recognized the image instantly. It was her. The moment had been brief, captured by accident during an evacuation under heavy fire. She remembered it not from pride, but because of the sound. The unbearable ringing in her ears that hadn't stopped for weeks. Below the image, a plaque read, "Unidentified medic Fallujah. Exact identity unknown." The words scraped across her chest like broken glass. She stood there, unmoving, long enough that others began to gather near, drawn by her stillness. A pair of college-aged girls whispered to each other, one gesturing subtly toward Abby as if placing her. A man in a blazer joined them, studying the photo, then glancing toward Abby. He squinted, half curious, half dismissive. "You know," he said, mostly to the group, "these displays are symbolic. They're not about individuals, it's more the idea, the anonymous hero, you know." Abby turned to him, her face expressionless. "It's not symbolic when it's your blood on the ground." He blinked, caught off guard, unsure whether she was joking or challenging. "I mean, obviously, but they don't want to glorify war. It's more conceptual." He gave her a polite smile, the kind used to end conversations with people who make others uncomfortable. "No offense." "None taken," she said, her voice flat. At that moment, the museum director entered the gallery, flanked by a photographer and a local journalist, taking notes for a story about the exhibit's community impact. The director, a tall man with silver hair and too much charm, began addressing guests near the military display. "This section, perhaps more than any other, reminds us of the hidden costs of our freedom," he said in a deep, rehearsed tone. "So many unnamed, unrecognized heroes who never asked for recognition. That's what we honor here." Abby turned back to the photo of herself, still labeled as unknown. She looked at it one more time, then reached into her bag and took out a folded paper. A field report, faded and wrinkled, bearing her name and ID number in the upper corner. She unfolded it slowly and placed it at the base of the display, weighing it down with a small piece of charcoal. Then she stepped back, said nothing, and left the museum without turning around. Behind her, voices murmured in confusion. One of the girls picked up the paper and read it aloud. The journalist approached, curious, asking who she was, but by the time they looked up, Abby was already at the exit, walking quietly into the orange light of the late afternoon. The second escalation wasn't loud. It didn't demand confrontation, it didn't need headlines. But the image was changed forever now. The unidentified medic had a name. Whether or not anyone wanted to say it out loud was no longer the point. It existed, carved into the record with ink and witness. The gallery's silence would never feel the same. The sun had nearly disappeared when Abby found herself walking toward the edge of the city's historic district, where cobblestones met the open stretch of the riverfront promenade. A soft breeze carried the scent of saltwater and magnolia, mingling with the distant sound of jazz spilling from an open-air restaurant further down the path. The crowds had thinned, replaced by the quiet wanderers of evening. Couples with clasped hands, joggers lost in rhythm, and the occasional stroller pushed gently across the bricks. Abby moved among them unnoticed, blending into the calm like a forgotten thread in an old tapestry. Yet inside her, the storm still stirred. Not in rage, but in the slow boil of something long submerged beginning to rise. Not for vengeance, not for spectacle, but for truth. She followed the path until it curved around a low, wrought iron gate, behind which a temporary pavilion had been set up for a community storytelling night. A small banner rippled gently in the wind, reading, "Letters from home, voices of service and silence." Curious but cautious, Abby stepped through the gate and paused at the edge of a loose gathering of lawn chairs and folding benches. A wooden platform had been constructed in front of a row of string lights, where a young woman stood reading from a sheet of paper, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke about her brother's deployment and the letters he used to send back, written. in careful block print because his hands shook too much for cursive. No one looked at Abby as she entered. No one stopped her or asked for credentials or comments or donations. She was just another figure in the dusk. She sat in an empty chair toward the back and watched, listened, absorbing each word, each pause, each nervous breath from the speakers as they took turns telling pieces of their lives. Fragments shaped like grief, like pride, like questions never answered. There was an honesty here, unpolished and raw, and something in Abby softened, loosened its grip on her ribs. When the young woman finished, polite applause rose and fell, and an older man stepped onto the small platform. He was tall, with a voice that carried even in the stillness, but his tone was warm, not commanding. He introduced himself not by title or rank, but simply as Daniel, and spoke about how memory can live in the body long after words have failed it. As he read a letter from his wife, written during his last tour overseas, Abby felt a prickling along her spine. Not of recognition, but resonance. These were not stories shaped for social media or engraved onto bronze plaques. These were wounds worn openly, quietly, in voices that sometimes broke under the weight of remembering. When the invitation was extended for anyone to come forward, there was a pause. Long, heavy. Then a shuffle. A teenage boy rose, eyes wide and unsure, holding a photo of a woman in uniform who had died the year he was born. He spoke haltingly, but the space held him. And when he finished, someone in the crowd, unseen, whispered, "Thank you." And it carried more weight than applause ever could. Abby didn't plan to stand. She had nothing prepared, no object to hold, no letter to read. But something moved her then, not a surge, but a quiet current, like a door opening softly from the inside. She rose and walked slowly toward the front. As she stepped into the light of the string bulbs, a few heads turned, but there was no shift in mood, no hush of expectation. Just space waiting to be filled. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't give a speech. She looked out over the small crowd and said simply, "I don't have a letter. Most of mine were never written, or were lost somewhere between one outpost and the next." She paused, not to build suspense, but because the words came slowly, honestly. "But I remember one. It wasn't addressed to me. I just happened to be the one holding the hand of the man who wrote it. He couldn't finish it. So I did." Her voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble. It carried with it a steadiness that came not from performance, but from experience. The kind that bleeds into the bones and stays there. "He asked me to write to his sister," Abby continued. "Said she was the only family he had left, that she deserved to know he was sorry. Not for dying, but for leaving again. For promising he'd come home and breaking that promise." A silence fell. No one moved. She looked down briefly, as if to collect the memory itself, then back up. "I mailed that letter when I returned stateside. I never got a response. Maybe I had the wrong address. Maybe she didn't want to hear from a stranger. Maybe she read it and it broke her in a way I'll never know." She shrugged slightly. "But I wrote it because he asked me to. Because it mattered." Her hands stayed still at her sides, empty. No medals, no symbols. Just her voice and the space around it. "Most people I meet don't know where I've been. And most days I don't tell them. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I got tired of being looked at like a headline, or a relic, or a warning." She exhaled softly. "Sometimes I just want to sit on a bench and draw a picture without someone deciding I'm a threat to the aesthetics of the sidewalk." A low ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd, soft, sympathetic. Not mocking, but real. Abby smiled then, barely. And in that moment her face changed. Not into something different, but into something fully seen. "I don't need to be honored," she said. "I just want people to stop mistaking silence for invisibility." She stepped down from the platform as simply as she had risen, returning to her chair. Around her, no one clapped. They didn't need to. What filled the space was something deeper. Recognition, respect without ceremony. The kind that cannot be demanded, only given freely when the truth is spoken plainly. As the evening ended, several attendees approached her. Not all to speak. Some just touched her shoulder lightly in passing. A woman pressed a folded note into her palm. An old man nodded with tears in his eyes. One young girl simply smiled, then looked away. No one asked for her story. They had already heard it. Not the details, well, those didn't matter, but the shape of it, the weight, the silence it carved, and the strength it required to carry it. Abby walked away from the event as the lights were being taken down, the last rays of the sun swallowed by the river. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel changed, but she felt real, present, whole. And that was more than enough. Morning came soft and blue, and with it, a gentler quiet than Abby had felt in weeks. The city had taken on a different tone, not louder or busier, but lighter somehow, like a room after someone finally opens the windows. She walked along the familiar street leading to the same small plaza where, just days earlier, a stranger had pushed her aside for blocking the view of a building she once helped design in her own way. Not with architecture, but with sweat and time, by protecting the lives of the people who made cities worth saving. The cafe was already open, chairs being wiped down, planters watered, the air filled with the faint scent of rosemary and coffee grounds. This time, no one stared. Or perhaps they did, but it didn't matter anymore. She wasn't here for their permission. She took her seat on the same bench where her presence had once been questioned, the same bench from which she had been asked to move for aesthetic reasons. This time she placed her bag beside her and pulled out her sketchbook, not to hide behind it, but to use it the way she always had. Not as a shield, but as a tool. She began to draw again, not a soldier or a battlefield or a broken city, but a young girl sitting on a bench under a tree, sunlight filtering through her hair. Her hand moved steadily, the page filling with shape and tone. Memory transformed into motion. From the gallery nearby, someone stepped out. A woman, early 30s, the same one who had asked her to move. She stopped when she saw Abby, but said nothing. There was no smirk now, no camera or curated excuse. Only a pause and then a quiet, almost imperceptible nod. Not quite apology, not quite greeting. Abby met her eyes, then returned to her drawing. Nothing more was needed. Across the plaza, an older man in a museum staff badge stood behind a small display table being set up for a public outreach event. Behind him, several easels had been arranged to show prints from the Faces of Service exhibit. One of them bore Abby's photograph, now retitled. The plaque beneath the image no longer read "unidentified." It now bore her full name, rank, and unit. Beneath that, just one sentence. She carried others until she couldn't carry herself. And then she still kept walking. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just the truth, written clean. People began to arrive. Slowly at first, then more steadily. Tourists, students, families. Some lingered, some passed through. A few stopped to read. A few recognized her. A young boy tugged on his mother's hand and pointed. "That's her," he whispered. "The drawing lady from last night." The mother glanced up, uncertain, then offered Abby a small, sincere wave. Abby nodded in return. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows from the oaks across the square, Abby closed her sketchbook. She sat back, face turned toward the breeze, letting it touch her skin like something familiar, something earned. She didn't need to be invited or remembered. She didn't need to explain or prove. She had done what she came to do, not to be seen, but to be present on her own terms. For the first time in a long time, she felt no weight pressing her down, no demand to defend her place in the world. The past had not disappeared. It never would. But now it lived with her, not against her. It walked beside her, not behind. And as people continued to move through the plaza, pausing, reading, glancing, not glancing, Abby remained. Steady, grounded, at peace. Not anonymous, not aesthetic, just real. The screen fades to black. A single line appears. Some stories don't need to be rewritten. They only need to be remembered.